Last week, Jeb Stuart Magruder, one of President Nixon's former aides, began a minimum term of 10 months in prison for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Magruder had come to the White House originally as an aide to H.R. Haldeman, working in public relations on the president's staff. Later, he was coordinator of the committee to re-elect the president. He subsequently admitted his guilt in the planning of Watergate and in the cover-up. Mr. Magruder has written about all of this in a book just published. It's entitled An American Life, One Man's Road to Watergate. And in the book, he points fingers of guilt. But, and this is important to know, after the book was written, Judge Sirica imposed on Magruder the gag rule, which says that a potential witness or defendant cannot discuss matters of an evidentiary nature regarding the Watergate case. Magruder will probably be called upon to testify at future trials of John Mitchell and H.R. Haldeman. So, even though Magruder can say things in his book, and I can read or quote from that book on the air, Magruder could not himself say these things or comment directly on them in this interview. Several weeks ago, we did a two-part interview with Mrs. Magruder, the very courageous wife, about the personal side of the family, the effect on the children, and the conditions which led her husband to do what he did. Last week, we questioned the man himself. This interview with Jeb Magruder was filmed in Washington 2 days before he entered federal prison. It is the last interview that he did. Mr. Magruder, in the president's taped conversations released to the public, President Nixon says about you, and I'm quoting, "Not a very bright fellow, a very facile liar. Magruder's a sort of lightweight in a very heavy job." What is your reaction to this coming from the man you felt you were serving?
Well, I think there would be very inhuman of me not to have been quite depressed and disappointed at the time when I did read the transcripts. I remember I spent one weekend, the weekend after they were released, reading the transcripts, and of course I was depressed over the total aspect of the transcript, as well as, of course, his references to me. I think in context, though, you'd have to understand that most of the comments he made relating to me came after they realized I was going to cooperate with the prosecution. And I'm afraid what happened in the atmosphere at the White House at that time, that I changed from being one of the team to one of the people who possibly was going to be giving evidence against others still in the administration.
You say that you read those tapes and you were, what was the word you just used?
Depressed.
Depressed. The tapes reveal President Nixon as an indecisive, faltering man. Was that the way he seemed to you then?
Oh, in the dealings I had with him, which were certainly of a much different nature than the types of conversations that, say, Mr. Haldeman or Mr. Ehrlichman obviously had on a continuing basis, he always was quite the opposite. I found him to be extremely decisive, extremely articulate, seemingly always in control of the situation. In all of the meetings and other things that I attended with him when I was in the White House or at the committee to re-elect, I saw none of those characteristics.
Do you think he's changed as you read those tapes?
Not necessarily. I think possibly that they were under such great pressure during that period of time when most of those tapes were being taken that there might have been this indecisiveness at that time. It was probably one of the great crises, obviously, of his career at that time.
What about the president's language? When you were with him, would you describe his language as profane, obscene, what?
Well, he, someone said he did have a salty language in his off-the-cuff comments when we would be in meetings, and so I was not particularly surprised about that aspect of the tapes.
Profane?
Yes, I think that.
Obscene?
Well, he was able to use what would be most of the words that would be considered obscene. Yes.
Okay. In your book, you speak of receiving a call from H.R. Haldeman, waking you the Sunday morning after the break-in in Watergate. You tell him that you know of the Watergate break-in, that it was your men who did it, McCord, Liddy, etc. You say, "I gave him the facts, I got my instructions, I spoke with the assumption that he knew of the break-in plan, and nothing he said indicated that he did not." You say in your book earlier, an order from Haldeman was considered an order from the president. Is this the way you felt, that if something came from Haldeman, it was with the president's knowledge and desire?
Certainly, anything that I received from Mr. Haldeman when I worked in the White House, I had to assume fit under the context of what the president felt was an appropriate action. So consequently, it might not have been something he directly said to Haldeman to do, but it was something that Bob, in knowing the president so well, knew would be an accepted order down to the secondary level.
From the very beginning, you talk of your meetings with John Mitchell, in which the Watergate break-in and the cover-up were planned and executed with John Mitchell's knowledge and participation. John Mitchell has called you, and I quote, a goddamned liar. At this point, is it just your word against his, and how is anyone to know that you're telling the truth?
Well, I think the fact is I have to now, and I decided when I agreed to cooperate with the prosecutors in April, that I was not going to continue with what to me was a charade. From my standpoint, I could not continue with it. I know I have told the truth from that time on, and that is all I can do.
Did you take a lie detector test?
Yes.
What did it show? Can you comment on that?
The indications I gather were, and I think it has been published, was that according to their method of evaluating it, that I was truthful in my answers.
What is it that you actually hope to find in the break-in? People are still asking that.
Well, I ask that question myself these days because it does seem to be certainly have been counterproductive.
According to the presidential transcripts, the president says, in talking about you implicating John Mitchell and Bob Haldeman, John, do you see any way that Magruder can stick to his story? Ehrlichman, who's in that meeting. Yes, because he's an ingenious witness, one would assume is the next word. President, if Magruder is going to lie about it, then what the hell is in it for him? Haldeman and Ehrlichman together, immunity. Now here's the president and Haldeman and Ehrlichman in private saying that what you are saying about Haldeman is untrue and that you are a liar. How do you answer that? It's on the transcripts.
Well, the fact is that much of what I think is in the transcripts was based on information and misinformation that they had. One of the things that did strike me when I read the transcripts was really how much or how little information they really did have. And consequently, much of their discussions were quite disjointed relating to actual happenings.
What do you mean, how little information they had?
Well, it was simply that they obviously did not have the facts as to what the various individuals, and I can, of course, only relate to myself, what they were going to do. One example is that on the Saturday, when there was one discussion between Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and the president, they talk about it would be good if we made sure Magruder went down to testify and come clean. Well, the fact is that 3 to 4 days before that, in a number of conversations which they did tape, which were with Mr. Higbee, I indicated that I was going to do that very same thing, and yet they're talking 4 days later as if this is an idea of theirs.
Are you saying or implying that they may have said this even though they knew that you were going to come clean because they were doing it on tape, and this tape might later be used to accomplish their point of view or their innocence?
Well, I really don't know what their purpose was. I do know that when they were talking on, I think it was on the Saturday conversations, I had already agreed to cooperate with the prosecutors, and they were basically quite aware of that. And the fact was that I had already told them in general terms that I knew that I could not continue this charade, and that I knew that the only answer would be for me to basically go down and cooperate with the prosecution. The other alternative would have been to take, I guess, the Fifth Amendment, which was a very unacceptable alternative.
But after you had told them this on the phone, you told Higbee, who was Haldeman's assistant. You told this to Higbee, and yet you now find that days later in these transcripts that they were talking about whether or not you would come clean.
That's right, yes. So there is a complete gap there, which would indicate either lack of information on their part or that they were trying to put something on tape themselves for their own uses.
You've not commented on this before?
No, I've not. I've never been asked that question.
We'll continue this interview with Jeb Stuart Magruder in the next half hour, and in that interview, Mr. Magruder gives his opinion of Ron Ziegler, John Mitchell, Charles Colson, and Richard Nixon. We hope that you'll be able to stay with us. Now it's time for a station break. interview with Jeb Stuart Magruder, former aide to President Nixon. He's now serving a minimum of 10 months in federal prison for conspiracy and obstruction of justice in the Watergate case. This interview was filmed in Washington 2 days before Mr. Magruder entered prison. You describe the president in your book as furiously angry against all liberals, and especially the liberal media, and that Haldeman agreed with him totally, and that if you didn't agree, you were sort of, you're either with the president or against him. If you didn't agree, you were against him. Once the president described, with no facts, one liberal network correspondent as a communist, and he asked you to get the word out. How could you do that?
How did I do which? Yeah, get the word out?
Yeah, I know. Now, how could you, knowing a man was not a communist?
Well, of course, I didn't know. I assumed that they were correct. I think I'd been in the White House a couple of weeks, and they said, that's the facts on this individual, and I assumed that they were correct.
Who was that network correspondent?
I'm afraid that I think that'd be more appropriate for me not to divulge that individual's name.
Have you ever?
No, I have not.
In your book, you're very frank in discussing your personal opinions of many of the people you work with at the White House. I'd like you to describe some of them, if you would. Ron Ziegler.
Well, Ron and I had, tremendous disagreements when I first came to the White House because my job was to reorganize. Part of it was recommend reorganization of some of the communications end, and Ron, I guess, felt I was a threat. I was not a threat. I had no intention of doing anything that would have disturbed his basic territorial prerogatives. But he perceived me as being a threat, and consequently our relationship was always very awkward.
Quote from Jeb Magruder. Ron Ziegler, stubborn, unpleasant, barely competent, power-hungry, little more than a ventriloquist puppet.
Yes.
Is he still?
I don't know. I haven't seen him in a while. I don't know. But I did not find him to be the type of person I thought should be in that position. I'm sure when Ron writes his book, he will be equally adamant about me.
I'll bet. You also said that he never said anything that hadn't been put into his mouth by the president or Haldeman.
I think that was a direct rule in a sense. One of the reasons I think he was selected as press secretary over Herb Klein, who was certainly more qualified, was that I think there was concern that Herb would become a spokesman in his own right, whereas Ron would do exactly what he was told to do and say it the way they wanted it said.
Charles Colson, you say, an evil genius. He made Watergate possible, perhaps inevitable.
Well, because he was a genius. I think he was a brilliant man. I think he was articulate. He was extremely bright. He understood politics very well.
He had the president's ear.
He had the president's ear. He was accepted as one of the inner circle. And, of course, there were, as you know, very few people in that inner circle. There were 3 or 4 people, really, 5 people.
Haldeman, Ehrlichman,
Colson, Kissinger, Schultz, possibly 1 or 2 others that were really in the inner circle.
Why evil?
Well, because as I think I describe in many incidents there, I think much of what Chuck did recommend and suggest and make sure happened were the kind of things that really had no place in our system.
Like, for instance?
Well, I think one of the better examples was the Kennedy write-in campaign in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, there were a number of listed candidates, and Chuck came up with the idea that if we started a write-in campaign for Ted Kennedy, this would cut away from Muskie's vote. He was a front runner at that time, and cut into the Democratic unity, which really didn't exist. We really didn't have to cut into it at all. It was just not appropriate. On the other hand, as I point out, I also had my hand in many things, so I can't... I think the evil genius in the book, the way I think as I read it again, is really myself, because I was fully aware that most of these things were not appropriate, and yet I was willing to go along with him. I do think in Chuck's case, he wrote me a letter just a couple of weeks ago. It was a beautiful letter. And I know there's been a lot of comment about his conversion to Christ. I feel he's absolutely honest, and I think personally if he puts his good efforts behind his new faith, I think he will be an asset to the community and to the country.
You knew Martha Mitchell very well. You write about her, and people have wondered if Martha Mitchell really has information that would shed light on Watergate. What do you think?
I don't think she does, no. Not real information, but, she may have done, I gather she says she listened into conversation. She may have.
You say in your book that living with Martha Mitchell distracted Mitchell, that it caused him to make political misjudgments? At one point, she was so impossible, you said to John Mitchell, why don't you divorce her? In what way was she so impossible?
Well, I think that...
Be as frank with me as you are
in the book. I think it was a very difficult marriage, and I think that she had her own problems at that time. And she has expressed most of these, I think, quite directly, very honestly herself. And consequently, it was very difficult for him to, in effect, have the dual role of Attorney General and in charge of the committee to re-elect.
Do you think he resigned from Crete because of her, as you stated?
I've always felt he did, yes.
That she was that impossible?
That's my own personal opinion, yes. At that time, yes.
Martha called you right after Watergate,
yes.
Right after McCord had
yes.
been arrested and complained about it.
Yes.
A few days later, her security man, Steve King, and a doctor had to give her a shot to quiet her.
Yeah.
Why? That's always been a mystery.
Well, I guess she was, and I don't really know the full details. I wasn't there, of course. I was back in Washington, but I guess because of McCord's arrest, she liked Jim McCord very much, and because of what was happening, I guess, in other areas.
Was it to shut her up?
Oh, no, just to calm her down.
To calm.
Yes.
Mr. Magruder, you talk in your book of being called by Vice President Agnew soon after the break-in. Your meeting with him took place in the tennis court. The Vice President said to you, Jeb, what the hell is going on? You said, it was our operation. We're trying to take care of it. The Vice President looked away and said, I don't think we ought to discuss it again in that case.
Well, I indicated in a very general way that it was our operation. How he interpreted it is very difficult for me to say. I never discussed it again with him.
Does that make him an accessory?
I'm not a lawyer.
You're not a lawyer. Knowing what you know now, would you vote for President Nixon?
Oh, I certainly would vote for a candidate, whether it was President Nixon or anyone else.
That's not what I asked.
Who adhered to the kind of ideals that I feel strongly about, which are the... that's not a question that is meaningful because President Nixon isn't going to run for office, and it is difficult for me to see a context
then answer it your way. You said you would certainly vote for a man.
I would certainly vote for a man whose ideals are the same type of ideals in political philosophy now. I'm talking political philosophy.
Are his the same?
Yes.
His ideals and his political philosophy?
His political philosophy is basically the same as mine. And
not his ideals?
Well, I think most people vote for a president, and I shouldn't say that. I don't know why most people vote for president. I think it's always confusing in election time why people vote. And we did a lot of work in the campaign on that and never figured out why they did vote. But I personally would always vote for a person whose political philosophy would mirror mine, because I would think that would be important.
Almost until the end, you felt that you were protecting John Mitchell. You felt very close to him.
Yes.
You described him as a father figure. This man has called you a goddamn liar.
Yeah.
How do you feel about him now?
Same way I always did about John Mitchell. He was a wonderful man to work for. He really was. He was one of the most enjoyable people I ever knew personally. I know his public image was quite different than his private image, but to work for him was just fun. It was
But you're not
interesting.
a saint, and look what he said about you. A goddamn liar. You still feel he's warm and wonderful towards him?
I have, of course, talked to John in the last year, but as far as my own personal feelings, he was under pressure at the time of the Senate hearings, and of course, as I said, I think at that time, he was a close friend of mine. I just don't think you go around abandoning people and dropping them off your ship.
Even though it happened to you?
Even though it happened to me.
We haven't talked about one man who's in prison, the only man who has kept his mouth shut. Oh. To a lot of people, that makes him a kind of hero, maybe a strange hero, and that's Gordon Liddy. Yeah. Tell me about Gordon Liddy.
Well, I think, people have asked me, why is he silent? And I think for Gordon, has been very important for him to be the one person to remain silent. I think it's been something that makes him feel that he at least can live with himself in that sense. And I'm not surprised that he has been silent.
You describe him as a pretty strange character.
Well, he was an unusual person. I think that's no question about it, isn't it? His background and training was quite different than most of ours.
Not only erratic, but excessive.
It was a
man who threatened to kill people.
Well, you know what I've often thought of? I was watching a rerun of Mission Impossible the other day, and I thought to myself, gee, if there really was a Mission Impossible, Gordon Liddy would have been on that team. Because Gordon was that type of guy.
So this is why you think he's staying silent. That's part of it.
That's part of it, and this was, he thought this kind of activity was very important, and he loved it.
He even talked once about killing the columnist Jack Anderson.
Yes.
Could he?
Well, he thought that I had indicated to him that we should...
you said, why don't we get rid of him?
Yeah.
And he took it to mean, why don't we kill him?
Yes.
And yet you continued to work with this. Did you think you might have really killed him?
One of my great mistakes.
Oh, yes, as you look at. Did you think you might really kill him?
Oh, it's hard to say what a person really would do. I got the feeling he thought if I was serious that was an order and that was to be carried out. But for me to say he would have done something of that kind is difficult.
Again, I guess we have to keep thinking of the climate. You go into prison 2 days from now.
2 days from now, yes.
What are you the most frightened of there?
Oh, I don't think it's frightening because I've had enough time to think about it. I've had enough people to talk with, people who've been there. And so I think I have a good idea of what it will be like. I think anything that you do new, I'm sure when you remember the first time you went off to camp or when I went in the service, I remember.
So you're not really scared of it?
It isn't that I'm scared, I'm apprehensive. I think.
Of anything in particular?
No, I think probably the thing that everybody says is the most difficult is the boredom.
Can you see your wife and the children?
Oh, yes, you can have visitors, but I'll be approximately 4 hours away from Washington, and my wife will have an awful lot to take care of with the 4 children, so it's going to be difficult for her to be up on a very continuous basis. She'll be there, I know, as often as she can, but I gather it can get lonely. You're living in conditions that are more the type that you lived in when you were a private in the Army 20 years ago, I guess might be an analogy.
At the end of your book, you say, why did Watergate happen? And you give 3 different reasons why you think. Could you perhaps briefly tell us?
Well, the first, I think, was basically the institutional structure. I think some of the best, most effective reading I've seen on Watergate has been the fact that the institutional structure of the White House
that the president is isolated.
Has built up so that the president is almost in a position of a king in a court rather than the president of a democracy. I think, too, there was no question that the president's attitude and his leadership, the leadership of the person on top always permeates down through an organization. And where his policies, I think, were outstanding. He did have, I think, this feeling that his enemies were out in this country and it was our job to get them and therefore get them. And whether we followed those instructions, I think Bud Krogh said it better, that when he was given the instruction to do anything to stop the leaks, he thought that meant anything, and then there he was. But the third point was, I think, that we who knew better, at least I think I knew better, were able to subjugate our own feelings and our own ethics to a higher goal, which we thought was more important than what seemed to be very minor situations at that time. Obviously, our ethics were muddled.
This is your last chance today to talk before 10 months of silence. And possibly when you come out, there may not be any interest. Is there anything of any nature that you haven't said that you'd like to say?
No, I think that I've spent the last 13 months thinking about this problem. I think I'm coming to some answers. I think I said in my statement to the judge that somewhere I lost that ethical compass. I think I've gotten it back now. I hope I have, and I think I will go on and I think live a useful life. I've had a tremendous support from Gail, particularly in the family, and I think we're going to be able to live a better life after I get out, and I think I can make use of that time as best I can in prison to come out in such a way that I will have a good 25 years of productivity for the family and for the society to some extent. So I'm as somebody says, I'm bullish on America, I'm bullish on myself. I think I will survive and be useful.
Mr. Magruder, there's so much more in the book that we could talk about. I assume people will read it. We've talked a great deal today, and I think enough. I think the rest of the hours should not be with me, but with your wife and children.
All right.
Thank
you very much.
I don't know what you say to a man going into prison. I wish you luck, and I hope that you do have that good life for you and your family when you get out.
I think we will. Thank you.
An interview with Jeb Stuart Magruder. Will be back for some comments after this word.